The M3 Lee is known for being one of the wackiest tanks ever built during World War II. But did you know that there were other variants of the M3 Lee? If so, then you can fuck off and jerk off to Femboy Warning while in your mother's basement. But if you're still here, then let me take you on a journey of M3 Lee variants while unrelated footage plays in the background. But first, what is the M3 Lee and why does it even exist in the first place? The M3 Lee was a stopgap tank that served from late 1941 till 1955. It was supposed to creatively put something out into the field until US factories had the machinery to make the sexy, illustrious, scrumptious M4 Sherman. After the success of the German Blitzkrieg in France in 1940, the US realized that it might need to sort Europe's problems again, cause whenever you look away, Europe seems to get bored and put their years of Hearts of Iron 4 gameplay to practical use. The US looked at their stash of M2 mediums and M2 lights and came to the conclusion that they would need better tanks to counter the German panzers. At the time, the US's best dedicated anti-tank gun was 37mm. But the US Ordnance Department also proved that the M2 75mm medium velocity gun had a kick-ass ability at taking out tanks. However, this presented a problem for the US. Their factories didn't have the machinery to mass produce a turret large enough to comfortably house the 75mm. So the engineers huddled up and made this. The M3 was a unique design for sure. It had two guns, a 37mm on the turret and a 75mm mounted in the hull. The tank was complemented with four M1919 30 cal machine guns, two in the hull, one in the 37mm coax, and another in the commander's turret cupola. It had a crew of 7 with a commander, a gunner and loader for the 37mm, a driver, a gunner and loader for the 75mm, and a radio operator. The tank was also extremely tall, but it's not surprising when seeing other US designs of that era. Great Britain originally wanted the US to make British tanks in American factories. However, the US rejected the idea as 1, they were British tanks, and 2, there was an unspoken fear that should Britain fall, the US would be stuck with factories configured to make tanks that the US had no use for. So the British asked to see what the US had in stock. The US offered to lend lease their M3s, but the British rejected it at first, mainly due to it being ridiculously tall, until the US played their ultimate negotiation card, by telling them that it was the only thing that they could produce in mass at the moment. So the Brits reluctantly accepted. But the British were allowed to request a modified version, which then became the Grant. The main difference between the Lee and the Grant is the turret and crew layout. The Grant got a chodier turret that got rid of the silly turret cupola, stripped it of its hull and turret cupola machine guns, and moved the radio from the hull to the turret bustle, thus getting rid of the radio operator. Later, the M3 was upgraded from an M2 75mm to an M3 75mm. The M3 75 was longer, had better penetration, and could also accept the M61 shot. The M3 could be seen on almost every front: North Africa, the Pacific, Southeast Asia, and even the Eastern Front. It's the basic bitch. No style, just vanilla. This is the M3 Lee you picture when someone says M3 Lee. It has a radial engine and a riveted hull. This was also the most numerous variant built, with 4,724 units produced. Just like the standard M3, the M3A1 had a radial engine, but unlike the M3, the A1 had a cast hull just like on the M4A1 Sherman. Fun fact, the reason why the M4A1 Sherman is called the M4A1 even though it was the first to be produced is because of the M3A1. The M3A1's main identifiable feature is that it has a curvy cast hull. Only 300 M3A1s were built. Once again, this Lee has a radial engine. However, the A2 significantly reduced the risk of rivets bouncing around the interior when hit, thus injuring the crew, because the A2 had a welded hull. Sadly, only 12 were ever made. Its main identifiable feature is the lack of rivets. Another fun fact, this was the first US tank to have a fully welded hull. Like the M3A1, it had a welded hull, but its side doors were now welded shut. This was because it was found that the side doors were weak points in the armor. However, this isn't consistent on all M3A3s, so it is not a main identifiable feature. The M3A3 had two diesel engines bashed together. Yes, the same one used on the M4A2 Sherman. Its main identifiable features are the welded hull and the engine deck, more resembling on the one on the M4A2. Small fun fact, you can identify if an M3 has a diesel or radial engine by looking at the engine deck. M3s with diesel engines have a more squarish engine deck grille, whilst M3s with radials have a rectangular grille more towards the center of the tank. Also a fun fact, if you see under the box thing on the M4, M4A1, and M4A4T, you'll see that it has the same grille as radial engine M3 Lees. 322 M3A3 Lees were ever built. Just like the M3A1, this M3 also has a correlation with its Sherman counterpart. The M3A4 had a Chrysler multi-bank engine, and if you know your Shermans, just like the M4A4, the M3A4 has an elongated hull to fit the Chrysler engine, or rather, engines. For those who don't know, the Chrysler multi-bank was made up of 5 smaller car engines. This makes the engine long, very long. The M3A4's main identifiable features are the elongated hull and small hump on the engine deck, just like the M4A4 has. The M3A4 also had a riveted hull. Only 19 were ever built. Like the M3A3, the M3A5 has 2 diesel engines. But unlike the M3A3, the M3A5 has a riveted hull. The M3A5 was predominantly used by the British and the Soviet Union, where by the British it was called the Grant II. Its main identifiable features is the engine deck and the riveted hull. The M3 CDL, or Canal Defense Light, was a variant of the M3 that used a British secret weapon. Basically, Churchill looked at a carbon arc searchlight and said, "Ah yes, this is good, but you know what would be splendid? If we stuck it on a tank and shined it at the enemy." Where's my cigar? The project started in the 1930s, and its role were night operations. In practice though, due to the absolute secrecy of the project, most crews didn't know how to properly formulate a plan using the CDL. 300 CDL turrets were made and were mounted on Matilda IIs, Churchills, and as already mentioned, M3 Lees. In late 1944, when crossing the Rhine, the CDLs were used in their intended purpose, operating at night and surprising the enemy. CDLs were also used on Shermans during the Korean War, where there was a need for night operating tanks. Shermans with CDL turrets were designated T-52, not to be confused with the T-52 SPAA with a 40mm Bofors stuffed into a ball turret. The M31 series of vehicles were M3A3s and M3A5s that were turned into recovery vehicles. The M31B1 were M3A3s and M3A5s that had their diesel engines replaced with radial engines, whilst M31B2s retained their diesel engines. A great way to differentiate between the two is by looking at the engine deck and seeing if it has a diesel or radial engine. There have been photos going around the internet of 2 M3 Grants seemingly with 75mm guns stuffed into the turret. These 2 tanks were both command tanks that had their primary and secondary armaments removed. Using the leftover space, they mounted a bigger radio to better communicate with other platoons. To mask that they were command vehicles, the crew mounted a dummy 75mm to the turret. Excluding the M3A1, M3A2, and M3A3, most Lees had a riveted hull, which when hit, The rivets had a tendency to bounce around the interior, bonking the crew as a result. Its weird and wonky layout made it difficult to operate. When in a hold-down position, the Lee couldn't fire the 75mm. Its operational range was far less than what the British were used to. The 75mm couldn't engage its flanks. Its radial engine had a low power-to-weight ratio, making the engine underpowered. The tank was stupidly tall, making Shaquille O'Neal blush, which was mainly due to the armament layout and radial engine. And when the 75mm was fired on the move, it would violently jerk the entire hull to the right. However, despite these flaws, the Lee was found to be a fairly capable tank. Both main armaments had gyro stabilizers, thus allowing the tank to fire accurately while on the move, which made the M3 Lee, apart from the Crusader and Stuart, almost unique. Its armor, when introduced, was able to withstand hits from the Panzer III and Panzer IV. Its 75mm was able to outrange and outgun any German tank in North Africa at the time. It was easy to repair, and with US Lend-Lease, there was no shortage of spare parts, and most importantly, it came at a time of need. The British extremely appreciated them, mostly due to the British having somewhat of a tank shortage after Dunkirk. The Soviets did allegedly call them a coffin for seven brothers. However, this is most likely post-war Soviet propaganda trying to undermine the importance that US Lend-Lease had on the Eastern Front, so the Soviets could say that they won the war all by themselves. Contrary to popular belief, the M3 wasn't as cramped as people make it out to be, and the Grant variant helped alleviate the problem by getting rid of the radio operator. The M3 Lee taught the US what to and not to include in a tank. If not for the M3, the development process for the M4 Sherman might have taken significantly longer and would have been a far worse and outdated design. We would have had a Sherman that still had the silly side doors and the M275 instead of the more capable M3 75mm. So the point I'm trying to make is that because of the M3 Lee being developed as a stopgap, the war was shortened by a few years and saved countless young lives in the process, and that is why the M3 Lee was such a needed tank.